Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Reviewing a book written by tonight's speaker, Science magazine once wrote that it offered, quotes, a grand tour of one of the most powerful and richly structured, complex, adaptive systems of our time, the mind of Murray Gell-Mann. We look forward to such a tour tonight. Welcome to tonight's long-awaited final lecture by Murray Gell-Mann, the Frederick S. Pardee Visiting Professor and Nobel Laureate. The Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future at Boston University was conceived and established by BU alumnus Frederick Pardee, whose vision and generosity brought it into being. Auspiciously, it was born at the start of a new millennium. Physically, we are located just down the road from here, but our eyes are fixed on the world of 2200 AD. The annual Pardee Visiting Professor program and the lectures such as tonight's to which it gives rise are only two of the programs through which we search for a vision of the future 50 or 100 or 200 years out. It's a pleasure and an honor to visit, to introduce tonight's visiting professor, Murray Gell-Mann, winner in 1969 of the Nobel Prize for Physics, professor emeritus of the California Institute of Technology, and a distinguished fellow of the Santa Fe Institute, of which he was a founder. He was educated at Yale and MIT, and I have studied his CV and can tell you that if I listed all of his titles and awards and citations, all the professional societies of which he is a member, his organizations, his professional activities, the offices he has held, there would be no time left for his lecture. So, without further ado, Professor Gell-Mann.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be able, after a long delay, to give this final lecture in the series that I've been presenting here under the auspices of the Pardee Center. A few months ago, that center sponsored a conference on the topic Looking Ahead, and I was asked to give the keynote talk at the conference dinner. I should like to begin this evening by expanding a bit on that talk, the title of which was A Crude Look at the Whole. That's whole with a W. Many of the points that I treat here were discussed in my book, The Quark and the Jaguar, which is still mostly relevant, I'm glad to say, even 11 years after publication. Over the years, I've organized some meetings devoted to aspects of the longer-range future, and I've seen how difficult it is to get most intellectuals to discuss future situations that are considerably different in some way from what we've already seen in the present or the recent past. As an example of reluctance to consider big changes, we might take the widespread failure to believe that the Soviet menace came with an early expiration date. There were lots of people to tell us that, but it was hard to get people to believe it. Usually, these intellectuals end up talking about not about major departures from present conditions, but relatively small ones. That's not a bad thing to do, but it's not what we mean by peering into the longer-range future. Well, despite my very limited experience, I was able to share some ideas with the scholars at that meeting, and I'll share a few of them with you now. I've spoken many times about how a great deal of research and teaching in the sciences and the humanities, especially at universities, is confined to individual departments representing particular fields of knowledge. And while specialization, subspecialization, and so on are inevitable and necessary, they need to be supplemented by research and teaching that transcend those sometimes narrow disciplinary boundaries. There are a number of institutions inside and outside of universities where such transdisciplinary activities are carried out. In particular, as you know, the Santa Fe Institute is devoted entirely to such activities. There, the study of transdisciplinary problems by self-organized teams of people, originally trained in many diverse specialties, is the rule rather than the exception. Similarities and connections among topics in very different fields are recognized and exploited. The participants may have started as experts in subjects from the physical sciences, the life sciences, social and behavioral sciences, history, or the other humanities, but they take part in discussions of all sorts of topics. Each team does have to include, of course, at least one real expert in the subject matter being discussed. I've often talked in public about the need for such research and about institutional arrangements for getting it done, such as having the Santa Fe Institute. But what I have to say this evening may sound similar, but it concerns a very different topic, which has to do not with academic disciplines and pure research and teaching, but rather with subject matter in policy studies, especially broad policy studies concerned with the future of the human race and of the biosphere of our planet, including the other species with which we share that biosphere. In considering any very complex system, we naturally tend to break it up into more manageable subsystems or aspects, defined in advance, and to study those more or less separately. For instance, in looking at the longer-term future, we might divide the various issues into such categories as military and diplomatic, political, ideological, environmental, human health and wellness issues, family, demographic issues, economic issues, including the crucial socioeconomic challenge of relieving extreme poverty, technological issues, scientific research issues, institutional or governance issues, issues of democracy and human rights, and so on and so forth. We might add other items, but the general idea is clear. In each of these categories, there are experts who have built their careers around those issues. And there are NGOs and, in many cases, government departments that worry about them. As a citizen, you might join one of those NGOs, say an environmental organization, or one promoting human rights, or one working for arms control, or one working for a strong national defense, or one working for human child health around the world, or whatever. Trying to break up the world problématique in such a way is natural and common. The difficulty is that understanding a nonlinear system, especially a complex one, by putting together descriptions of various parts or aspects, will work only if those parts or aspects interact weakly, so that the whole system is decomposable. But that's not true of this world problématique. No one has found a way to decompose it into aspects that interact only weakly. And in that sense, there's truth in the old adage that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, which sounds silly at first, but is true in this sense. How do we separate environmental issues from those involving population growth? Can you consider those in isolation from technological change or from economic policy? Can we think about the attempts to alleviate extreme poverty without considering the unwise, environmentally destructive projects that are sometimes carried out in the name of that worthy cause? Can we discuss issues of global governance without considering politics in the various countries and regions, and without treating the competition and conflict among different ideologies? If military and diplomatic policies fail and mankind is plunged into a hugely destructive war, which is not at all impossible, perhaps even one involving thermonuclear weapons, can our other objectives be attained? Are we really going to worry about saving wolves after a thermonuclear war? And so on. Isn't economic growth threatened by the widespread prevalence of fatal or debilitating diseases? Can we separate off questions about democracy and human rights? And what if democratic processes bring to power elements of society hostile to human rights and to tolerance, or ones that favor environmental destruction or aggressive war? Think how Adolf Hitler took power legally before destroying the whole democratic political system in Germany. Or Klement Gottwald in Czechoslovakia came to power legally. Some people make fun of naive idealism about elections, a lot of which we've encountered lately, with the slogan, "One man, one vote, one time." While separate consideration of the various aspects of the world situation is necessary and desirable, it has to be supplemented by integrated thinking that puts together the studies of various aspects, including the interactions among them. We have to get rid of the idea that careful study of a problem in some narrow range of issues is the only kind of work to be taken seriously, while integrated thinking is relegated to cocktail party conversation. We face that situation in a great many places in our society, including academia and most bureaucracies. Some of my remarks on this subject were quoted near the beginning of one of Tom Friedman's books. I think it's the one called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. He came to a similar conclusion through his career working for the New York Times. He was assigned to cover first one set of issues, then a different one, then a third one, and so on. Each time he was reassigned, he observed that what he was covering was intimately connected with what he had been covering earlier. No one had told him that would be so. Besides the work on the separate categories, we must have, in addition, the work of teams of brilliant thinkers, many of them specialists, devoted to considering the whole ball of wax. It can be argued, of course, that this is too big a job for anybody, no matter how talented or erudite, to do really well. That's true. Of course, such an ambitious aim can be accomplished only crudely. That's why I refer to it as taking a crude look at the whole. Now, the chief of an organization, say head of government or a CEO, has to behave as if he or she is taking into account all the aspects of policy, including the interactions. It's not so easy, though, for the chief to take a crude look at the whole if everyone else in the organization is concerned only with a partial view. Even if some advisors to the chief are assigned to look at the big picture, it doesn't always work. A few years ago, the CEO of a gigantic corporation told me that he had a strategic planning staff to help him think about the future of the whole business, but that members of that staff suffered from three defects. They seemed largely disconnected from the rest of the company. No one could understand what they said, and everyone else in the company seemed to hate them. For an integrative effort to succeed, some kind of simplification is naturally required. Certain things have to be treated in a cursory fashion and others in more detail. That's what physical scientists would call coarse graining. It cannot be accomplished through the categories established in advance. It has to follow from the nature of the world system itself. The necessary coarse graining has to be discovered, not imposed. Think of the relation between weather and climate. No clear results will follow from trying to examine the weather at each little place on Earth in each short interval of time while neglecting the strong interaction with other phenomena. But much can be learned from a study of weather suitably averaged over space and time, suitably, not just averaged in any old way, suitably averaged over space and time and treated along with such things as ocean currents, the nature and quantities of atmospheric pollutants, the fluctuations in solar radiation, and so on. Such a study of climate can be immensely rewarding. But it's essential to find the right coarse graining of the weather and the other phenomena for obtaining a useful definition of climate. Alternative scenarios for the future are like a branching tree, with major branchings at the special points where chance has a huge effect or where important transitions occur. One can try to estimate probabilities at the branchings in this branching tree of historical scenarios. Maybe thinking about such structures helps us to identify occasions of great policy leverage with respect to the future. I like to discuss many of the issues facing the world under the rubric of sustainability. It's one of today's favorite catchwords. It's rarely defined in a careful or consistent way, so perhaps I can be forgiven for attaching to it my own set of meanings. Broadly conceived, sustainability refers to quality that is not purchased mainly at the expense of the future. Quality of human life, quality of the environment. I use the term in a much more inclusive way than most people. Sustainability is not restricted to environmental, demographic, and economic matters. Refers also to political, military, diplomatic, social, institutional, or governance issues. And ultimately, sustainability depends on ideological issues and on lifestyle choices. So as used here then, sustainability refers not only to sustainable population, economic activity, ecological integrity, but also to a considerable extent to such matters as sustainable peace and global security arrangements, sustainable preparedness for possible conflict, sustainable democracy and human rights, sustainable communities and institutions. All of these are closely interlinked. In the presence of destructive war, as we said, it's hardly possible to protect nature very effectively or to keep some important human social ties from dissolving. Conversely, if resources are abused and human population is rapidly growing, or if communities lose their cohesion, conflicts are more likely to occur. If huge and conspicuous inequalities are present, people will be reluctant to restrain quantitative economic growth in favor of qualitative economic growth, as would be required to achieve a measure of economic and environmental sustainability. At the same time, great inequalities may provide the excuse for demagogues to exploit or revive ethnic or class hatreds and provoke deadly conflict, and so forth. So all of these things interact with two-headed arrows. In the book, The Quark and the Jaguar, I suggest that studies be undertaken of possible paths towards sustainability in this very general sense during the course of this century, in the spirit of taking a crude look at the whole. This goes beyond trying to estimate the probabilities of various likely scenarios in the future. Rather, one would look for more sustainable futures, even if they seem to have low probabilities. Is there any way, is there any chance of obtaining a more sustainable future, of attaining a more sustainable future? Let's employ a modified version of a schema introduced by my friend James Gustav Gus Speth, who was then president of the World Resources Institute, which we helped to found together, and later head of the United Nations Development Program. Now he's the dean of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale. The schema involves a set of interlinked transitions that have to occur if the world is to switch over from present trends toward a more sustainable situation. One, the demographic transition to a roughly stable human population worldwide and in each broad region. Without that, talk of sustainability seems almost pointless. The coming decades are expected to witness a historic change in the curve of world population versus time. World population is now going through an inflection point. Just a few years ago, the rate of increase went through its maximum and is now beginning to go down. So world population is expected to level off during the next century, during this century, that is, at a figure almost twice the present number, perhaps, but not infinite. Today, high rates of population growth, associated particularly with improvements in medicine and public health without corresponding declines in fertility, still prevail in many parts of the world. It's typically true of tropical, less developed regions, including countries such as Kenya, for example, that can least afford it ecologically or economically. Meanwhile, the developed countries have generally achieved rather stable populations, except for the effects of migration, which will certainly be a major issue in the coming decades. Scholars have engaged in much discussion of the factors thought to be responsible for the decline in net fertility that's taken place in most developed countries. They now suggest measures that may help to produce similar declines in various parts of the tropical world. Those measures include improved provisions for women's health, literacy, further education, and opportunities to participate in the workforce, as well as other advances in the position of women. Reduced infant mortality, which starts, of course, by working in the opposite direction, but may later prevent couples from compensating for expected infant deaths by producing more children than they really want. So then it would be acting in the positive direction. Social insurance for the elderly, which is still a very distant goal in many developing countries, but one that may yet ease the pressure on producing sons to take care of people in their old age. Naturally, the availability of safe and effective contraception is crucial, but so is the erosion of traditional incentives for having large families. In many parts of the world, the average couple, and especially the average man, still wants to have many children. How can people be persuaded in culturally appropriate ways that in the modern world, small families are in the common interest, with higher levels of health, education, prosperity, and quality of life in general than would be possible for families with many children? With swings in fashion having such importance in human affairs, what can be done to help the idea of small families to become more popular, more fashionable? Is it worthwhile to point out that with increasing urbanization, the traditional importance of having many sons may have become to some extent an anachronism? What kinds of incentives could be offered to one-child or two-child families? There are programs like that in certain countries like Thailand and Indonesia. These questions are still sadly neglected in many places, especially by organizations that claim to be helping to solve the world population problem. The leaders of those organizations are, of course, justifiably enthusiastic about measures to improve the lot of women, but they tend to oppose measures to persuade men of the desirability of small families. They adopt the consensus position reached at the international meetings in Beijing and Cairo, where efforts to talk sense to men were somehow confused with coercion. If human population has really just gone through its inflection point and will level off globally and in most places in a few decades, not only is that a historical process of the greatest significance, but its timing and the resulting numbers are likely to be of critical importance as well. The exact character and magnitude of the effect of reduced population growth on environmental quality, of course, depend on many variables, such as patterns of land tenure and so on, and they're worth careful study in various different areas. But it seems overwhelmingly probable that on the whole, population growth encourages environmental degradation, whether through the huge consumption rates of the wealthy or through the desperate struggle of the poor to survive at whatever cost to the future. The environmental consequences are likely to be much more serious if the world simply waits for improved economic conditions among impoverished populations to effect reductions in net fertility, as opposed to trying to encourage such reductions in parallel with economic development. The damage during the waiting period could be enormous. The total environmental impact per person is likely to be considerably greater after economic growth than before. And the fewer the numbers when relative prosperity is finally achieved, the better for the people and for the rest of the biosphere. The example of China is relevant here. Whatever one may think about the methods used there for population limitation, it is certainly helpful, now that individual prosperity is on the rise there, that several 100 million births were averted. Imagine all those additional people buying and operating cars, besides the ones who are going to do so, in fact. Number two, the technological transition to methods of supplying human needs and satisfying human desires with much lower environmental impact per person for a given level of conventional prosperity. Decades ago, some of us, particularly Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren, pointed out the obvious fact that a measure of environmental impact, say in a given geographical area, can be usefully factored into three quantities, multiplied together. It's just an identity, but it's a useful identity. The factors are population, conventionally measured prosperity per person, and environmental impact per person per unit of conventional prosperity. The last factor is the one that depends particularly on technology. It's technological change that has permitted today's giant human population to exist at all, and while billions of people are desperately poor, quite a few others manage to live in reasonable comfort as a consequence of advances in science and technology, including medicine. The environmental costs have been huge, but nowhere near as great as they may be in the future if the human race doesn't exercise a certain amount of foresight. Technology, if properly harnessed, can work to make the third factor as small as can be practically arranged given the laws of nature. That's the environmental impact per person per unit of prosperity. How much the prosperity factor can be increased, presumably a nice thing to happen, how much the prosperity factor can be increased without damaging the environment even more, depends to a considerable extent on how much is squandered on the first factor, mere numbers of people. Evidence of the beginning of the technological transition is starting to show up in many places, even though the bulk of it is yet to occur. Even apparently simple technological fixes, however, can end up posing very complex problems. Let's take an example, eradicating malaria in human populations in the tropics. Not too long ago, the draining of swamps was considered to be the principal method of control. Nowadays, it is understood that the destruction of wetlands is to be avoided whenever possible. Meanwhile, science has identified the plasmodia responsible for malaria and the mosquito vectors that carry them. Spraying with chemical pesticides, especially DDT, to eliminate the mosquitoes seemed to be a big step forward, but turned out to have serious environmental consequences, as you all know. For one thing, birds at the top of the aquatic food chain got very concentrated doses of the metabolic product DDE, which caused thinning of eggshells and hence reproductive failure in many species, including the bald eagle, the U.S. national bird. In the 1970s, DDT was phased out in the developed world, and the threatened bird species started to recover, and they have recovered. In many poorer countries, it's still used, but then resistant strains of mosquitoes have started to appear. It turned out that some of the immediately available replacements for DDT were very dangerous to humans. Now, though, much more sophisticated methods are available for reducing the populations of the vectors, including the use of chemicals that specifically target those mosquitoes, as well as the release of sterile mating partners and other so-called bioenvironmental controls. Such measures can be coordinated in what is now called integrated pest management. So far, these are still fairly expensive if deployed on a large scale. In the future, cheaper and equally gentle methods may be developed. Insect repellents are also available, but when used over wide areas, they're expensive and they cause problems of their own. Meanwhile, a simple behavioral approach that's effective in many places is to use mosquito netting at dawn, to stay under it for half an hour or so at dawn and at dusk when the vector mosquitoes are biting. The females, of course, do the biting. But that problem seems to have been overcome to some extent. In any case, one could keep children under treated netting. They're presumably not quite so busy, although in many places they have to do a lot of things. Since I wrote about this years ago, this has become a very well-known cause, and money is being collected on a fairly large scale around the world to finance the distribution of treated netting to people threatened with malaria. Someday, anti-malarial vaccines will probably be developed, which may even wipe out the various forms of the disease entirely. But then another difficulty will arise. Important wild areas that had been protected by the dangers of malaria will be exposed to unwise development. So you mustn't expect ever to win completely. I have no doubt spent too long on this apparently simple example, simply in order to expose some of its complexities. Analogous complexities can be expected to crop up anywhere in the technological transition to lower environmental impact, whether in industrial production, the extraction of minerals, food production, or energy generation. Like the partial conversion from defense industries to civilian production, the technological transition requires financial assistance and retraining for workers as opportunities close down in one kind of employment and develop in another kind. Policymakers may be well advised to consider these different types of conversion as posing related challenges. Thus, ceasing to manufacture chemical warfare agents would be regarded as similar to phasing out logging in the old-growth forests of the Northwest of the U.S. And such policy issues come up again when society tries to reduce the consumption of products injurious to human health, whether legal ones like tobacco or illegal ones like heroin and crack cocaine. 3, the economic transition to a situation where humanity is not living so much on nature's capital, but mainly on the interest on that capital. Imagine a visitor to a little New England village who notices an old man walking down the street, a man whom everyone shuns. Children run away at his approach. People cross the street to avoid meeting him. The visitor asks his host, "Who is that? Why is he treated that way?" The answer is, "Oh, that's Eustace Barnwell. He dipped into capital." But the human race is using up capital, not just dipping into it. We're wiping out gigantic forests at an almost unbelievable rate. We're depleting many of the world's fisheries. We're using up clean air by polluting it. The economic transition can be described as one in which growth in quality gradually replaces growth in quantity, while extreme poverty, which cries out for quantitative growth, is alleviated. The economic transition has to include what economists call the internalization of externalities. Prices must come much closer to reflecting true costs, including damage to the future. If they do not, then we're effectively stealing from the future. For example, if air or water quality is treated as a free good in economic transactions, then pollution or waste is deemed to cost nothing. Authorities have attempted for centuries to deal with such problems by means of prohibitions and fines, but those were often ineffective. Today, regulation is being tried on a massive scale in some places, and some successes have been achieved. It seems, though, that the most efficient way for governments to deal with such issues is to charge, more or less, for the cost of restoring quality. Regulation, with its fines and other punishments, can, of course, be regarded as a form of charging. Regulators, however, often require specific actions from polluters, whereas internalizing costs encourages restoration of quality, or avoiding its degradation in the first place, by whatever means is cheapest. It's the engineers and accountants of the industry concerned who prescribe the measures to be taken, and micromanagement by bureaucrats is unnecessary. Charging is usually better than regulation, and certainly much better than mere exhortation. But for one thing, it reduces ambiguities. Suppose you're engaged in awarding green medallions to products with low environmental impact. Soon you encounter a problem. Particular detergent may be lower in phosphates than others, and thus produce less eutrophication, growth of algae, in lakes. But the same detergent may require greater energy use because it needs hotter water in the wash. As you go on, you find more and more such trade-offs. How do you balance one consideration against another? If at least a crude attempt is made to charge producers for eutrophication and for waste of energy, then ordinary price competition should help with the problem. The green medallion may become unnecessary. You just look at the price. The great difficulty, of course, is figuring out how to estimate true costs. Economics never really succeeded, as far as I know, in coming to grips with subtle issues of quality and irreversibility. One does not usually encounter in economics textbooks any quantity analogous to entropy in physics. Of course, these issues can be shoved over into the political arena and treated as matters of public opinion only. But surely, in the long run, science should have something to say about them. Meanwhile, the simplest approach is to estimate the cost of restoring whatever is lost. In the case of the truly irreplaceable, some form of strictly enforced prohibition is presumably still needed. A critical part of any program to charge true costs is the elimination of subsidies for destructive economic activity, much of which wouldn't pay off at all if it weren't for the subsidies. In the work of the Brundtland Commission, the World Commission on Environment and Development, the brilliant Secretary General of the Commission, Jim McNeill of Canada, pointed out that in order to see what's happening to the environment in a particular country, you don't look at the activities of the ministry responsible for the environment, you look at the budget and the work of the Ministry of Finance. It's there that destructive subsidies can be hunted down and sometimes, with great political difficulty, killed. Discussion of budgets leads directly to the question of whether national accounting procedures include the depletion of nature's capital. Usually they don't. If the president of a tropical country contracts with a foreign lumber company to have a large chunk of the nation's forest chopped down for a low price and a bribe, the national accounts typically show the price as part of the national income, and maybe even the bribe if it's spent at home rather than being sent to a Swiss bank. But the disappearance of the forest, with all its benefits, current and potential, does not appear as a corresponding loss. Nor is it only tropical countries that sell their forests too cheaply, as attested by the fate of the temperate rainforests of the U.S. Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, and Alaska. Clearly, the reform of national accounting systems is a real need in many parts of the world. Fortunately, some progress has been made in this direction. As our example makes clear, the struggle against major corruption is also a key element in achieving the economic transition. Here, non-governmental organizations such as Transparency International have made very useful contributions. But curiously, in much of the discussion within those organizations, at least as far as I know, it is mainly the inefficiency of markets in the presence of corruption that's emphasized, rather than the difficulty of making any regulations or charges effective. If you can get around all these things by giving a bribe, then why bother? Another indicator of the level of concern over living on nature's capital is the discount rate. I understand that the World Bank, in financing projects with large environmental impact, still used to apply a discount rate of something like 10% per year to the future. I don't know if that's still true. If it is, it means that the loss of some great natural asset 30 years in the future is discounted by a factor of about 20. E to the 3, e to the 30 times 0.1. In other words, the natural heritage of the next generation is valued at 5% of its assigned value today, if indeed it's discounted, even if indeed it's counted at all. The discount rate used in this way is one measure of what's called intergenerational equity, which is crucial to the notion of sustainable quality. Discounting the future too steeply amounts to robbing it. If the notion of discount rate is generalized somewhat, it can be used to encapsulate much of what is meant by sustainability in an environmental context. 4, the social transition to a society with less inequality. Many economists call attention to trade-offs between intergenerational equity and equity within a generation. In our concern for preserving things for the future, are we somehow shortchanging the very poor people of today who need to exploit some resources in order to survive? As remarked earlier, the transition from growth in quantity to growth in quality is fine for people who are at least moderately well off, but for the very poor, the decline of quantitative growth is obviously not appropriate. The social transition to greater equality should make that decline more acceptable. For example, fuel taxes, much in the news these days. Fuel taxes necessary for conservation adversely affect the poor who require transport to work. But the impact of such taxes can be reduced by giving a subsidy to the working poor, such as a negative income tax that is not tied to fuel consumption. Although some of the degradation of the biosphere today is caused by the very poor scrabbling for a living, much of it can be attributed to the wealthy squandering resources on frills. But also, a considerable amount of it is connected with massive projects that are supposed to help the rural poor of one or more developing countries, but often do so, if at all, rather inefficiently and destructively. In contrast, the same people can often be aided very effectively through large numbers of small efforts applied locally, as for example in the practice known as micro-lending. It's become very well known now. When I first wrote about it years ago, through my experience with the MacArthur Foundation, it was not so well known. A financial institution is established to provide very small loans to local entrepreneurs, many of them women, to start small businesses that employ local people. Frequently, such employment is comparatively non-destructive and contributes to both intergenerational and intragenerational equity. Fortunately, micro-lending to support sustainable economic activity is becoming widespread. Also, it's interesting that the rate of repayment of the loans is extremely high, 96%, 97%, something like that, which most people are very surprised to hear if they don't know about it. Today, even more than in the past, no nation can deal with problems affecting either urban or rural economic activity without taking account of international issues. The emergence of the global economy is obviously a dominant feature of the contemporary scene. That brings us to the institutional or governance transition. The institutional transition to more effective means of coping with conflict and with the management of the biosphere and human activities in it is number 5. We're now in an era of simultaneous globalization and fragmentation, in which the relevance of national governments is declining somewhat, even though the power to take action is still concentrated largely at the national level. Some power is shifting down to parts of national states, such as cities and provinces. Also, countries such as Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union have actually broken up into smaller states. But this downward shift of power seems destined to be exceeded in importance by a shift upward to the regional and global levels. Most of our problems involving security, whether in the narrow or the broad sense, have global implications and require transnational institutions for their solution. We already have an amazing variety of transnational institutions. We're not usually aware of how many there are and how varied they are. Some of them have been around for more than a century, although, of course, others are more recent. Here's a tiny list of just a few percent of what there is. The air travel system, the International Postal Union, the Convention on Broadcasting Frequencies, Interpol, migratory bird treaties, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, the Convention on Chemical Weapons, the International Council of Scientific Unions, PEN, the International Writers' Organization, financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, multinational corporations all the way from McDonald's to IBM, UN agencies such as UNEP, UNDP, UNFPA, WHO, UNICEF, UNESCO, and so on. The use of English as an international language should not be ignored. Negotiations continue on issues of the global commons, those aspects of the environment that are not generally recognized as belonging to anyone and therefore belong to all, such as the oceans outside of the coastal zones, space, Antarctica, and so on. To some extent, the relations between more and less developed countries reflect what the U.S. diplomat Harlan Cleveland has called the planetary bargain, in which resource transfers from wealthy countries to poorer ones carry an obligation for the poorer ones to take measures that advance sustainability in this broad sense. We hope that this pattern will cover more and more activities. Then there's the ideological transition to a worldview that, as we mentioned, combines local, national, and religious and regional loyalties with a planetary loyalty, planetary consciousness, a sense of solidarity with all human beings and to some extent with all living things. Only by acknowledging the interdependence of all people and indeed of all life can we hope to broaden our individual outlooks so that they reach out in time and space to embrace the vital long-term issues and the worldwide problems, along with immediate concerns close to home, which will always be interested. This transition may seem even more utopian than some of the others, but if we're to manage conflict that's based on destructive particularism or tribalism, whatever you want to call it, it's essential that groups of people that have traditionally opposed one another acknowledge their common humanity. This is an age-old problem, the sharp and often violent competition among peoples labeled by different language, religion, race, nation, or whatever. It's a terrible curse. Many such struggles are going on as the world experiences simultaneous trends toward unity and fragmentation. No difference is so small that it cannot be used as a label that divides people into antagonistic groups. The chaos in Somalia over the last couple of decades is an example. Language difference? No. Almost everyone speaks Somali. Religious differences? No. Nearly everyone is Muslim. Different sects? Not really. Clan differences? Yes, but they're not the real problem. It's mainly sub-clans that have been fighting all these years under rival warlords. Nevertheless, as we'll discuss maybe some more if we have time, or not if we don't have time, a progressive extension of the concept of us has, after all, been a theme in human history from time immemorial. One dramatic manifestation today is the greatly diminished likelihood over the last 50 years of armed conflict in Western Europe, after two enormous armed conflicts in the last century. Another one is the radical transformation of relationships that's often called the end of the Cold War. The recent damping down of long-standing civil wars in a number of countries is also fairly impressive, even though it's accompanied by the outbreak of a few others. In studying all these transitions that we've listed, it's tempting, as in the other situations we discussed, to break up the study and investigate each aspect, in this case, each transition, separately. But again, that's clearly the wrong approach. The transitions are very strongly linked to one another, as we saw, and if they do occur in the foreseeable future, say during this century, they will happen in closely connected ways. So we have, as usual, to take a crude look at the whole and allow the necessary coarse graining to emerge and not try to impose it. It's reasonable to ask why a set of transitions to greater sustainability should be envisaged as a possibility during this century. The answer is that we're living in a very special time. Historians tend to be skeptical of most claims that a particular age is special because they've heard those claims so many times in the past. But this turn of the millennium really is special, not because of our arbitrary way of reckoning time, but because of two related circumstances. A, the changes that we humans produce in the biosphere, changes that were often remarkably destructive even in the distant past, when our numbers were very few, are now of order 1. What I meant by that remark is that many paleontologists believe that the Pleistocene megafauna were wiped out by the tiny number of people who existed at that time through, for example, stampeding herds over cliffs in order to eat one animal or use two for clothing, something of that kind. If that's true, then we were very destructive even then. But our numbers were few and we couldn't do much. In any case, what happened was local. Now it's different. We've become capable of wiping out a very large fraction of humanity and of living things generally if a full-scale world war should break out. Even if it does not, we're still affecting the composition of the atmosphere, water resources, vegetation, animal life in profound ways around the planet. While such effects of human activities have been surprisingly great in places in the past, they were not global in scope as they are now. B, the graph of human population against time has the highest rate of increase ever, and that rate of increase is just beginning to decline. We mentioned that earlier. So the curve is just past what is called a point of inflection. In general, this century, the century perhaps of inflection points in a number of crucial variables, seems to be the time when the human race might still accomplish the transitions to greater sustainability without going through real disaster. It's exciting to see some actual world modelers appearing on the scene. For example, at that Pardee conference on looking ahead. They really try to study the interactions among developments in a wide variety of policy areas and thus peer into the future. But as I've made clear, I believe it's important to supplement these attempts to make predictions, presumably probabilistic predictions, with searches for possible pathways toward a particular kind of future, sustainable and desirable, even if that is judged to have very low probability, which I suspect it does. One might discover ways to increase that probability, to find particular branchings in the tree of alternative possible histories at which there are points of leverage. This is a somewhat different use of modeling, leading not so much to bets about the future as to a quest for policies that might promote certain kinds of futures judged to be beneficial. In the mid-1990s, a few of us attempted on a small scale an integrated study of possible pathways leading to greater sustainability in this century. We called it Project 2050. So it was a matter of thinking about the next 60 years. Now that's the next 45, so we better move the date up. This project was undertaken by a consortium of 3 organizations: the World Resources Institute, the foreign policy part of the Brookings Institution, not the economics part, and the Santa Fe Institute, with WRI, the World Resources Institute, taking the lead. The project produced a number of useful documents, such as Alan Hammond's book, Which World?, in which he examines possible scenarios for the future of the environment. But it didn't really come up to the original expectations. The main reason for that is that the project was very badly underfunded. In planning for it, we estimated the cost at 10 to 20 million US dollars, with 8 million as a bare minimum. The John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, of which I was then a director, voted it 3 million, a generous amount, and it was natural to suppose that the other large foundations would make sizable contributions as well. In fact, though, none of them contributed anything. The MacArthur Foundation often supported projects started by other foundations, but those others only rarely supported our initiatives because they tended to be more adventurous and less conventional. Given the amount of support we received, we should have used our comparatively meager resources entirely for a planning exercise, devoted to thinking about what a successful Project 2050 might look like if properly funded. The resulting report could then have been used, among other things, to raise more money, perhaps enough for the actual project to be carried out and have a considerable impact. In fact, much of what transpired at the various meetings we held did bear on the question of what form the project should take. Even to make the planning exercise work properly, we needed the services of the kinds of world modelers that seem to be around today. SFI, for all its virtues, and it has very many, could not play that role. SFI is an organization well adapted to creating simplified models of complex systems, models that can be studied with a combination of analytic and computer-based methods, and can teach valuable lessons. SFI is not, however, equipped to carry out big studies that process vast quantities of many different kinds of information, unless it's just a matter of finding regularities in such data, which one can do very easily. SFI could contribute important theoretical insights, but another institution was needed in addition, one that could provide a strong modeling team dealing with diverse kinds of data from many times and places. The tendency of human beings to divide themselves into labeled groups that don't get along and sometimes come to blows, which we discussed earlier, may turn out to be in part an inherited tendency. Science has not determined that yet. Might be an inherited tendency left over from a time tens of thousands of years ago when such behavior might have been adaptive. Certainly it's not adaptive now in an age of highly destructive weapons. Also, the tendency of our species to wreak unnecessary havoc on the environment might also be an inherited relic of an earlier age, when there were not many people and the ill effects of environmental abuse, while often very severe even then, were at least geographically restricted. But even if it should turn out that these tendencies are to some extent inherited, we know that they can be modified by culture. That's one of the saving features of humanity. So while most human beings continue to distinguish sharply between us and them, people have made a huge amount of progress over the ages in widening the concept of who we are, as opposed to them. As was mentioned before, the largest unit of human society to which loyalty is owed has grown from the nuclear or extended family to a clan, a tribe, a city-state, a nation, even a region. And we human beings seem to be moving, although gradually and with many, many disheartening setbacks, towards supplementing our local and national feelings with a planetary consciousness that embraces the whole of humanity, and also in some measure the other organisms with which we humans share the biosphere. The studies that we are discussing will certainly involve a mixture of scenario writing and computer modeling. The striking feature of anything involving computer modeling is the trade-off between detail and transparency. If a model is so general that it can be applied crudely to a wide class of systems, such as probably exist on many planets scattered through the universe, then it may be simple enough so the results of a series of runs can be rather easily interpreted. If, however, special features of our own planet and its history are built in, chosen from such subjects as terrestrial biology, the nature of human beings, human history and social organization, so on and so forth, then the results of running the model will be far harder to interpret. The model will be technically complex. But the results of running the model may well be much more relevant to some real scientific or policy problem if they include all these features of the actual planet we live on and the actual people that we are and so on. So a way to improve the transparency of a model is to set it up so that many of the assumptions and parameters can be altered at will. Many people can then come and play with those features in different ways, moving the levers around, changing the assumptions, changing the parameters. If conclusions survive that kind of treatment, they're likely to be fairly robust. That was one of the many, many problems with that report, The Limits to Growth, 20 years ago, the first report to the Club of Rome, which gave a black eye to system studies for a long time. It had many, many defects, but one of the most important is that the parameters were not easily varied and the assumptions were unclear and not easily changeable. It was too bad that would have been a wonderful study to do in the privacy of one's own office with the shades drawn. It was the publication with a great deal of hoopla that was the problem and that got modeling in trouble for many, many years. The most important caveat for any simple model of a complex system is not to take it too seriously. If conclusions from studying the model are to be applied to policy issues, the warning must be even sterner. You may cause great harm if you take it too seriously. On many occasions, as everyone knows, very evil consequences have ensued from the application of oversimplified scientific, or even worse, pseudoscientific models to matters of policy. A famous example, of course, is social Darwinism in the 19th century. People used the metaphor of Darwinian biology to discuss the competition among humans in the marketplace and so on. Led to terrible tragedies, including, to some extent, the Irish potato famine. One of our visitors to Project 2050 suggested wisely that models be used as prostheses for the imagination. That seems to be the best way to handle them. Aids for the imagination. In that role, they can be extremely valuable. Let me close with a remarkably relevant quotation from a sonnet by Edna St. Vincent Millay, supplied by a source that some of you may find surprising, one of President Clinton's science advisors. In fact, he's written a book starting with this quotation. It's from Edna St. Vincent Millay's poetry book, Huntsman, What Quarry? Upon this gifted age, in its dark hour, falls from the sky a meteoric shower of facts. They lie unquestioned, uncombined. Wisdom enough to leach us of our ill is daily spun, but there exists no loom to weave it into fabric. Thank you. Oh, I'm looking forward to questions. Questions, comments, insults, all kinds of things.
We have about 20 or 25 minutes for Professor Gell-Mann to answer your questions. I'll just ask this one thing. If you're asking a question, wait until someone with a microphone comes up to you so that we can all hear the question.
I slashed this talk ruthlessly, so we have time for questions. So I hope there are some.
We heard President Clinton claiming that he has figured out, just a few days ago, I'm sure on television you must have heard some of it.
No, I didn't.
Well, he claims that he has figured out a way of making sure that gift money is properly channeled to the needy. I was delighted to hear that, but it sounded a little bit too good to be true. Does it make sense to you?
Well, maybe he meant it approximately. He's a very clever fellow. He's one of the most intelligent people that I know. There are only two people I've known who regularly finished my sentences for me, Robert Oppenheimer and Bill Clinton. Anyway, it sounds like a great thing to make progress on, even if it's only slight progress. These tragic floods and so on have brought out the scam artists, apparently, in force, collecting money for the victims, pretending to collect money for the victims, allegedly collecting money for the victims. Maybe Bill Clinton could figure out a way to deal with that right now. I hope so.
How do you see the role of the U.S. Changing or staying the same in the next century?
Oh, well, the U.S. has, in some respects, had a predominant role in the last decades, much of the last century. That's been studied by lots of people and analyzed, and some of it has to do with preeminence in industrial production, economic activity, and so on. Some of it has to do with military power, that is, in the last few decades anyway. A lot of it has to do with soft power. Joe Nye at the Kennedy School, who might have been Secretary of State at one time, but never was, unfortunately. Joe Nye has very much emphasized this concept of soft power. Refers to the fact that we have, in this country, had an extraordinary flourishing of science, technology, art, humanities. It's not just in physics and electrical engineering and things like that we have excelled, but in things like Byzantine history and many, many kinds of art. People wanted, many people from all over the world wanted to come here to study. I think in the last few years that's become a little bit less true as we've made so much trouble for people coming here. Perhaps we had to because of security considerations. I don't know. But in any case, it's less pleasant than it used to be, I understand. But this soft power has been one of the really important things about our country. In the future, though, one can see that there are a number of possibilities for this kind of predominance passing from the U.S. If we don't pay attention to our civilization and to cultural interchange with the rest of the world, we let it rot, so to speak, we could lose a great deal of that soft power. Competition from other countries could make a huge dent in the other kinds of predominance. An obvious candidate is China, which certainly has a lot of people and a very strong cultural tradition, and is now becoming very much more active than it was before in a great many fields. We could imagine that maybe 100 years from now we'd be in an age where China would play this kind of predominant role. Who knows? But certainly, if we pay attention, it seems to me that in this country we can still retain a very important position in the world, and we don't really need to bully other people. We just need to be successful, it seems to me. We need to pay attention to security, of course, but there's no reason for us to try to impose our will on other people so much as to influence them through our example and through soft power and so forth. Does that convey anything of what you wanted to know? It's just my opinion, of course.
Yes, my question is, do you think that the education of a typical student between the ages of 18 and 22 should change, and if so, how? As a specific example, you might want to address the undergraduate education of the typical sciences student.
Well, I've written about that a number of times, given very unpopular graduation speeches about it. I think there were times when the faculty wanted to assault me after such a speech. I've often wondered whether it really makes sense to have so much of what we call teaching going on. I mean, learning is extremely important, but whether the learning consists mainly of having some teacher teach you in a traditional, conventional fashion, that I've never really believed. Here we are on the east coast of the U.S. In this time zone, 10 o'clock on Monday morning, there will be a gigantic number of classes on electricity and magnetism, all up and down the eastern seaboard here. Just imagine how many colleges there are, colleges and universities. In each one, there's somebody teaching electricity and magnetism on a blackboard. Is there any point in that whatsoever? I don't think so. I mean, you could have a nice film of some great teacher teaching electricity and magnetism if you want, although there's always the textbook. What you need people for is straightening out students who've gotten stuck. Because when you learn by yourself, you often get stuck. And having somebody available who can help you in such moments is very important. You need somebody to set an example, to be an example of someone who knows the material and has worked with it and has achieved great things in that field and so on. That's very good, too. You may need somebody to talk with you personally in a kind of lecture, once or twice, so that you get the feeling of it. But why you need to have the whole course of lectures, and while 2 blocks away there's another course of lectures on the same thing by somebody else and so on. I've never seen much point in that. Of course, it provides employment to teachers, but the teachers could be used for the other purpose, for tutorials, for setting an example, for doing all sorts of wonderful things. They could still be employed. It's just this so-called teaching that I've never found make much sense. Also, it's general rule, I think, that you learn best from people who are just ahead of you. So, although it's often deplored that a lot of so-called teaching is done by teaching assistants rather than by the famous professors, and while it's very important for students to meet the famous professors and talk with them, I think that's really critical. Still, a great deal of the routine learning and routine introduction into the field, whatever it is, can best be done, I think, with interaction with people who are slightly older. Undergraduates with graduate students with postdocs, and so on and so forth. Certainly this was my experience. I enjoyed very much meeting and talking with older, famous professors. It was a very important thing in my life that I knew them. But the actual details of improving my understanding of things mainly were connected with talking with people slightly old, only slightly older. Does that answer your question at all? Or were you thinking of something different?
I was thinking of whether you thought most programs were too specialized. For example, undergraduate physics curriculum.
Well, I don't know, undergraduate physics curriculum. It's very hard to design undergraduate physics curriculum. One thing is the problem of including recent developments in the science. and that's true of graduate students as well, not just undergraduates. Louis Alvarez, great experimental physicist, got his PhD from the University of Chicago around 1932, and never learned quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics was too good for graduate students. It was too recent. Maybe they weren't sure it was true. I don't know what the problem was, but they didn't teach it. It was too new. You have mechanics courses where they go over the simple harmonic oscillator and the Kepler problem, and that's it. And modern mechanics, classical mechanics, is enormously rich, and it's based on the idea that those problems are very special and not typical at all of mechanics problems, and so forth. So that's one big problem. Shouldn't one include much more recent developments rather than just the same old stuff that they studied a century ago? At Caltech, we redesigned the undergraduate curriculum at one point, and we decided that we needed to make the freshman and sophomore courses much more exciting. And so we turned that over to my colleague, Dick Feynman. And the result is his famous Feynman lectures, which were very popular. And they were really splendid for the freshmen and sophomores who attended them. But then there was a movie and books and so on and so forth, and they didn't have quite the same impact when he wasn't there anymore. And of course, he didn't continue to teach this course year after year. It was just once. He would say things like, law of friction. Well, there couldn't really be such a thing as a law of friction. Laws are at a much more fundamental level. Friction is a very superficial kind of thing, and you have rules which are approximately true, but they're not really laws. And then you have the so-called coefficient of friction, the applied force and the proportional to the frictional force proportional to the applied force with a certain coefficient. You can look up that coefficient for different substances on different substances in the Handbook of Chemistry and Physics. He said, but actually it doesn't depend on the substances, it depends on how much dirt there is there, and so on. He would go on and on like this. It was very interesting, and I'm sure the students learned a huge amount. But when it was then taught next year by a teaching assistant who said, you have to memorize that there is no such thing as a law of friction, and so on and so forth. It was turned into a routine matter, and I don't think we really accomplished what we set out to do with that course. But what it has been great for is adults learning physics. For adults who already studied physics a long time ago in the conventional way, this course is a marvelous gift. I don't think it was turned out to be so great for freshmen and sophomores, except the original freshmen and sophomores. So I think it's a tricky matter, designing a curriculum. But if the whole thing were done more in the spirit of encouraging people to learn rather than teaching, I think we'd be way ahead.
What do you think the effects of oil and its potential upcoming shortage are going to be on, people and the population growth and just in general everything you discussed?
I don't really know much about the details of the coming oil crisis, if there is one. I really don't know. There are various. When the price gets high enough, you can tap all kinds of new sources, of course. I don't know what's going to happen to it, but what I do know is that de-emphasizing various comparatively beneficial sources of energy is really crazy. and the most important source of energy is conservation, not using the energy in the first place. And at the moment in this country, we don't seem to have a policy of encouraging conservation or encouraging sustainable sources of energy, which is really too bad. And I think that's true irrespective of whether the oil is getting cheaper or more expensive or what. Also, oil has complicated our foreign policy to a huge extent in ways that seem unnecessary. I simply am completely out of sympathy with the energy policies that we have at the moment. I also think that a lot of other policies are out of whack. We seem to be in an era of faith-based science, rejection of scientific results, rejection of the scientific enterprise, official sympathy for intelligent design and creationism and things of that kind, represents a real contempt for science. So does making it difficult for scientists to give their opinions on policy matters honestly. I served on the President's Committee of Science Advisors, whatever it was called, under two presidents, Clinton and earlier Nixon. And in both cases, we were encouraged to, well, especially under Clinton, we were encouraged to give our actual opinions and state, as far as best we knew them, the scientific facts. With Nixon, it was slightly more complicated, but still, it wasn't the way it is today, where apparently the science is made to serve a particular policy option that's decided in advance. So I'm unhappy about all those things.
First of all, I'm a physics undergrad, so I apologize if this question is too specialized or poorly framed in any way. But given things such as like the butterfly effect, giving rise to chaotic systems and things such as weather, what makes you believe or what makes you hopeful that the systems that you model involving large numbers of people and very complex systems are not chaotic and thus nearly impossible to model beyond
Oh,
the
I
near
think
term?
they are nearly impossible to model. I think that's true. And I'm sure there are phenomena of chaos here and there. But I think also that it's not a hopeless business to look at it, to coarse grain in some appropriate way, to look at the various scenarios and the way they bifurcate over and over and over, and try to understand something about how that works. I think it can produce some useful results. But as I said, the main thing is not to believe it too much. And one reason not to believe it too much is because of the uncertainties that you mentioned. But I think one can learn a huge amount, nevertheless, by fooling with these things.
In your lecture, you talked about the simultaneous trends of fragmentation versus unification.
Yes.
And I was wondering how that played into the role of world politics. How do you see the developing role of the structure of government affecting world economics, world policies, and your view of the future? How is the management of resources in the future going to be done? Is it going to be done in a more unipolar sort of way, as in one hyperpower controlling or heavily influencing world affairs like the U.S., or many powers such as the U.S., China, and the EU working together to influence world affairs, or a global state sort of?
Well, the global state is a long way off, I think. I think we're in an era now when there is some degree of movement, some amount of movement toward a transnational governance in various domains. I mentioned 20 or 30 organizations. There are scores more. They all represent a certain amount of transnational governance, and they are connected. Their existence is connected with the fact that power is bound to move to some extent up and to some extent down from the nation state, even though the nation state retains most of the authority, most of the force, and the ability to carry out things. So there's this sort of contradiction between those two facts, that power has to move up and down from the nation, but it's also the ability to do things is concentrated very much at that level. But I think that one has to get used to this idea that many things will be decided more locally and many things will be decided more globally. And for a country that's to some extent predominant, like ours now and recently, it's hard to swallow that one really has to consult with the others and one really has to be a world citizen. I worry about what's called, what is it called? American, what's the word I want? Exceptionalism, right. American exceptionalism. It's a very strong tendency through many periods of American history. The idea that we are a special country, we are God's country, and we do the right thing. It doesn't matter what it is, but it's the right thing. And we don't have to engage in entangling alliances, and we don't have to consult other countries, and we don't have to behave like a normal world, like a normal country belonging to the world, and so on. I think that's a dangerous attitude to continue to have. And of course, China has always thought of itself as being the main place, the Middle Kingdom. And when diplomats arrive from somewhere else, of course, they are bringing tribute to the emperor and so forth. So we see another example of exceptionalism, but I think China is coming to grips with the idea that it's not, at least not yet, the center of world affairs. And it would be nice if the U.S. were to take a more gentle approach to these things. It's somewhat analogous to emphasizing soft power in addition to hard power.
I have a quick question. I was hoping to hear some insights from you about reproductive technology with an emphasis toward sidestepping evolution, how cloning and reproductive technology will sidestep, if you will, the mechanisms that have been in place for millennia in influencing population growth, or you mentioned malaria earlier, and if you could just speak briefly.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand. What about population growth and malaria?
Do you feel like, I'm talking about years to come, that reproductive technology, if it was generally accepted in society, would greatly expand population growth, or sidestepping the mechanisms in evolution, for instance, where different mechanisms that would be put in place to prevent population from growing well within the bounds, the balancing, if you will. I know I'm speaking quite vaguely.
I don't really quite understand. Human population will be limited. Only a certain kind of economist could believe that you can have growth forever in a finite world. I think even most economists don't believe it anymore. In fact, one economist said, if something that's going on can't keep going on, it will stop. And that's good. I'm glad they understand that. The population will be limited. It will be limited by something. If it's not limited by our own policies and our own actions and so on, it'll be limited by disease, famine, war, and so on. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, it'll be limited in that way. Somehow it'll be limited. But another thing that perhaps you were referring to is that our technical skills are becoming so great that a lot of natural processes will be outstripped by them. I mean, we'll still have ordinary mechanisms of evolution playing a big role on a small scale, like the coming into being of resistant strains of bacteria, or the coming into being of resistant mosquitoes when we use agents to suppress them and so on. That kind of thing will continue, and we'll have to fight against it. But the larger mechanisms of evolution, the larger scale mechanisms of evolution may be overwhelmed by human activity. That is, we will have more to say about the biological future, perhaps, than ordinary nature. As we fiddle more and more with things around us, we may become a more potent force than the usual evolutionary development. Is that what you meant?
Yes, I think you hit on it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly quite possible. It's not absolutely necessary that it happen, but it could certainly happen. In that case, we will need still more wisdom, even more than we need now. And this sort of speculation and modeling and so on about the future will be even more important. I agree, though, that it's very difficult and likely to be wrong. Still, I think it's very important to try. One can gain some degree of wisdom sometimes, even from things that don't completely work.
Thank you, Professor Gell-Mann. Please join us just outside the doors here. There's a reception, and we'll be glad to continue out there.